Great.
So here we go. This is our last session of the IAPT 7 conference. And Daniel Deasy is our next speaker. Very welcome, Daniel. And there won't be lunch afterwards. I mean, we're free to go everywhere, but at 3 p.m. we reconvene for the symposium. So I hope to see you, I mean, most of you, if not all of you, in the afternoon. Daniel, I'll leave it to you. Thank you very much for accepting.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And before I begin, just quickly, if we don't do it later, just a round of applause for the organizing committee, maybe. And especially you, Silvia, because you've done so much. And yeah, you've been amazing. He's not there. And that guy as well. Doing an awful lot of work. Okay. Thank you for the invitation. So this is my first live talk since 2019, I think. So apologies if I seem to be feeling the physiological effects of doing this for the first time in such a long time. So my topic today is really just the start of a project that I think is very interesting and that I think should be of interest to most philosophers of time. I think it's a foundational question that I'm going to be talking about, but it's not one that very often gets a separate treatment from other sort of foundational questions in the philosophy of time. So what I'm going to try and do is just describe the question and the views at play, and trying to give some sense of their significance and why they're interesting, and then do a little bit of the work of connecting them to other debates and views in the philosophy of time with which we're more familiar. And then maybe, if time permits, look at one argument relevant to the debate that I'm talking about. This is a pretty narrow approach I'm taking. I'm just starting from where I'm really familiar. So I've really just taken most of what I'm talking about from two books, which I think are very good. Berit Brogaard's 2012 book, Transient Truths, which is an excellent book, and is, as far as I know, the only sort of book-length treatment of this question. There may be others, and apologies if there are to those authors. And then a little bit from an unpublished book manuscript of Cian Doerr's, which my copy of which is, I think, 10 years old, so I probably shouldn't even be mentioning or citing it or quoting from it, so don't tell him, perhaps. That should come out someday, I think, with OUP, but who knows. Okay, so the question I'm interested in is, are there temporary truths, or are all the truths about the world eternal? And just to gesture towards the significance of this question, it's easy to hear that question as being, in a certain frame of mind, as being about sentences, or about the language we use, or the way that we represent the world in terms of, cognitive significance, or about, if you're of this frame of mind, about, abstract objects and the nature of certain kinds of abstract objects that you might call propositions. And all those things are certainly connected with the question, but I don't think that's all there is to it. So I have a view that when you ask the question, or when I ask the question, are there temporary truths? I'm not merely asking a question about how we represent the world, not merely about the sentences we use or about the nature of abstract objects. I'm asking the question, does reality itself have have aspects which are temporary, or is reality itself are all the aspects of reality eternal? So to use Ted Sider's metaphor, were you to write out the book of the world, as it were, describing the world in its fundamental nature, in its entirety, would that book need to change? Would it need to be updated in any way? Or does the book just stay the same? And I think every philosopher of time in the background will have an opinion on this question, or ought to have an opinion on this question, even if it isn't what you're most centrally interested in. Okay. Oh, I've lost the ability to, sorry. I can no longer click, I think. Oh, there we go. Thank you. There we go. Hello? Good. Okay. So, framing this in terms of propositions is one way of thinking about it. And it's just a convenient way of speaking, I think, as long as we bear in mind a couple of principles that I'm going to take for granted about how proposition talk connects with the world itself and our representations of the world, or the epistemic attitudes we bear to the world. So you might have heard often the idea that propositions, what are they? They're the primary bearers of truth and falsity. They're the objects of attitudes like belief and knowledge and assertion and so on. And so I'm just going to put these two principles on the table as governing my use of the word proposition. The first says that, for it to be the case that a proposition P is true is for it to be the case that P. So, given that I'm in Barcelona, the proposition that I'm in Barcelona is true, and if the proposition that I'm in Barcelona is true, then it follows that I'm in Barcelona, right? So, my being in Barcelona is something about reality itself. It's about the world. It's not, when I say I'm in Barcelona, I'm talking about Barcelona and me, and and what this principle does is it connects talk of propositions directly to talk about the world in that way. That's the intent. So we really want these two things, and you can accept this principle, whether if you're a Platonist about propositions, then you'll think that you might think there's some reason why this principle holds. You may have to explain why, how the world is and what the proposition, which of these abstract objects are true. What sort of links them up in some way. If you're a nominalist, you're probably going to give some translation of this into you're not going to want to disagree with it in any case and give some nominalist paraphrase of it or something like that, or you just take it as true in some less than metaphysically committing way, or you might just not go for either of those options and just say, look, when we talk about propositions, we are by default talking about reality, and this principle is just a way of making that clear. I mean, that's a bit like nominalism, but it's not exactly. I'm not going to worry about the difference. The key thing is that this principle governs talk of propositions, and then the second one just connects propositions with objects of belief and so on. So it says the proposition that P is such that to know or believe or assert it is to know or believe or assert that P. So if I believe that I'm in Barcelona, that's for the proposition that I'm in Barcelona to be believed by me. And if that proposition is believed by me, then I believe that I'm in Barcelona. That connects belief with propositions, and then obviously propositions with reality. So I hope that's, am I talking too much? Is that what's happening? There you go. Okay. So let's start at the very beginning. Some propositions are true and some are false. It's true that I'm in Barcelona, false that I'm in Madrid. Nothing mysterious about that. And then we can think about, okay, among the true propositions and indeed the false ones, or let's just focus on the true propositions. Are some of them true, but only contingently so? So could I have failed to be in Barcelona? Yes, of course, very easily, given the current circumstances, could have failed to be in Barcelona. You say, well, it's contingent that I'm in Barcelona, or if you like, that proposition is contingently true. Is it always true that I'm in Barcelona? Well, clearly not. Sometimes most of the time I'm not in Barcelona. So it seems very natural to think, look, there are these two views, call them propositional contingentism and propositional temporalism. The first says there are propositions that are true, but not necessarily true. And the second, which I'm really interested in, says there are propositions that are true, but not always true, such as that I'm in Barcelona. You might think that's just a completely obvious thing that propositional temporalism is true. But of course, many philosophers deny it. They reject it in favor of its negation or its denial, propositional eternalism, which says that anything that's true is always true. Whatever's the case is always the case. Or if you like equivalently, if you like talk about times, but for any proposition, if it's true, then it's true at every time. You won't find any variation in its truth relative to times. And of course, if it's always false, it's never true relative to time. Now, there's two ways of being a propositional eternalist. One is quite bonkers, and the other is the one that's most popular. The first would be the view that, so if you thought that every proposition was eternal, but there was only one time, then you would be a propositional eternalist. Right? That would be quite an odd view. If you were a presentist who thought that reality was frozen, then you might be that kind of propositional eternalist. If you thought that there were no concrete objects and that everything was just an abstract, everything was abstract, but you also thought that this sort of one time at which all these there's still one time that we're in this frozen abstract time, then you might be you think that all the truth never changed on either of those views. But the most common view, of course, is that every proposition is eternal, but there are many times, and that seems to be the, as it were, the normal view. So you can find this commitment to propositional eternalism in Frege, for example. He says, but are there not thoughts which are true today but false in 6 months' time? Sounds like, think of thoughts as being propositional things here. The thought, for example, that the tree there is covered with green leaves will surely be false in 6 months' time. No, for it's not the same thought at all. The words, this tree is covered with green leaves, are not sufficient by themselves for the utterance. The time of utterance is involved as well. So Frege is saying, look, it's true that the sentence, this tree is covered in green leaves, as spoken at different times, can express something true at one time and false at another. But what's expressed on each occasion of utterance is an eternal proposition. It's a proposition that never changes its truth value. And why doesn't it change its truth value according to Frege? Because what you express using that sentence will have a time determination. It'll tell you something about when the tree, according to the speaker, has the green leaves. Only a sentence supplemented by a time indication and complete in every respect, and we'll be generous and assume he's not saying we should all speak by dating everything we say, but rather he's talking about what we express, expresses a thought. But this, if it's true, is true not only today or tomorrow, but timelessly. The time-specific proposition expressed by the sentence on an occasion of use. And what's interesting here too is that he says such claims, such propositions are timelessly true. And I just want to draw attention to that. I've been talking about propositional eternalism, the idea that every proposition is, if true, always true. Frege is now introducing another slightly different notion of timeless truth. And I think that's really interesting. There's an interesting question as to how that relates to the notion of eternal truth. And then Nathan Salmon has a very similar view. He just says information has to be time specific. If it's not time specific, it's not real information. And if we read that in, it's easy to read that as a commitment to propositional eternalism. And now you might say, well, look, what about sentences like Joe Biden as US president? Surely that's true. And isn't it just obvious that Joe Biden is only temporarily US president? So going back to my earlier, that I'm in Madrid is surely true and only temporarily true. How can what I'm saying be eternal if that sentence is only temporarily true? And the idea, as gestured in it's kind of indicated in the Frege quote, is to adopt some so what propositional eternalists do is they adopt some kind of contextualism about tense, which we've seen already in the Frege quote, according to which, the tense of a sentence or some other aspect of a sentence like Joe Biden as US president allows that sentence to vary in what it says, the proposition it expresses, what it says about reality, depending on when it's uttered. So, screen off all the other contextually sensitive elements of a sentence. Time is introducing a further such element. So, I can say today, I'm in Barcelona, and I'll express something that's contextually sensitive to the time I say that. And similarly, I can say it in a week's time, and I'll express something else that's contextually sensitive to the time that utterance is made. So I'm not going to get into the details of, there are all sorts of things about how the semantics of contextualism about tense should work out, and there's a huge literature on this, and I'm being rather sort of simplistic about it. But the normal view is something like this. Joe Biden, my utterance now of the sentence Joe Biden is US president expresses the claim that the proposition that Joe Biden is US president at N, where N names the time of utterance, it introduces the time of utterance. And to say that Joe Biden is temporarily US president, that's true as well, because it says something like Joe Biden is US president at this time N, and there's a time T before this time, such that at that time, Joe Biden is not US president. So that's one way for him to be temporarily US president. Temporarily looking to the past, of course, it could be a bit more general. And note that the propositional internalists can be quite flexible about what times are here. So you might worry, so are we is this whole debate fixed on the notion that there's some kind of privileged foliation of space-time and so on? But of course, all this can be modified to replace times with relevant regions of space-time, and then the operators, things like was and will just get the tenses, as it were, get a slightly different treatment. So it might be time relative to a reference frame, or it might be just spatiotemporal regions. I'm just going to keep things simple for myself by sticking with times. So a question which is interesting is propositional internalism the view that every proposition is time specific? And that's something you seem to see in Frege, as we saw earlier. He says, I should reply the sentence about the inhabitants of the German Empire, great example, is not a complete expression of thought at all, since it lacks a time determination. So it requires a date to express, or a time to express a thought. And that might give you the impression that propositional internalism is the view that the facts always mention what time, as it were, things are happening at, in some sense. That every truth is time specific, which is slightly different from the claim that every truth is, if true, eternally true. We need to distinguish those two things. Couldn't the proposition that Joe Biden exists, full stop, be true given propositional internalism, and therefore eternally true? Or can it only be eternally true if I specify the times at which he exists, or something like that, or the region of space, if he's a perduring thing, the region of space-time that he occupies, or something. He exists at R, or is located at R. I think this is an interesting debate. It's a common, I think, misconception about propositional eternalism, that it does require that every truth is time specific. So Brogard in her book, I think, expresses something like that view. And I think you can see this in her point here. She says, what I'm calling propositional eternalism makes it difficult for metaphysical eternalists, block universe people, to articulate the commitments of their own theory. Because they think that past and future objects are real, they want to say that Socrates exists. So, they look at the whole block and they say, if they're perdurantists, oh, there's a region of space-time occupied by Socrates, so Socrates is there as a perduring object in the block. But she says the combination of semantic and metaphysical eternalism makes it difficult for them to articulate these commitments. And here's the reasoning in the second half of that quotation. No need to go through it twice. She reasons like this: suppose you were a block theorist and you think, well, it's a consequence of my theory that Socrates exists. Given propositional eternalism, that's always true. So it's always the case that Socrates exists. And given that I don't think always is a fundamental part of, I don't think tense operators are going to appear in my complete and accurate description of reality, I'm going to say that's equivalent to saying at any time t, at t, Socrates exists. So given that, if Socrates always exists, for me, that means that he exists at every time. But of course, that leads to a disaster, because it then follows that Socrates exists at this time. And Brogard assumes that if you're a block theorist, you'll take Socrates existing at this time to consist in his being located at this time. And it would so the simple commitment to Socrates existing would end up falsely committing you to the view that he's somehow located at the moment we're in now, and that seems completely wrong. And I think this does two nice things. It brings out the question of whether eternal truths need to be time specific in order to be eternal, and it brings out the question of the difference between having a view of eternal truth as being eternal or timeless. So it does nice double duty, I think, for both of those questions. So Brogaard's approach to this puzzle is to say, look, 2 is false. Even if you're a block universe theorist, you should deny that every truth is eternally true. That's the way to avoid this problem. You need to try and reconcile the block universe with temporary truth. So it was a mistake to think that if anyone who associates the block universe view with the view that the book of the world never changes, in some sense, that's a mistake. You need to be able to combine the two views. And Brogaard has a way of doing that, which is very interesting and important. An alternative, I think, taking the timelessness view a bit more seriously, is to say that yes, 2 is false. I agree, but it's false because it's a defective expression of propositional eternalism. So on this kind of view, if you're a block universe theorist, really what you want is to say, look, there are 2 different ways of describing the world, and never the twain shall meet. You should never mix the language of tense with the language of, with the real description of the world. So, the book of the world will say what's happening at every region of space-time or at every time. To say that the contents of that book are always true, now that's a big mistake. The language of always and sometimes and was and will is just a completely separate language. It should never be mixed with the language of AT and what's happening in various regions of space-time. And I think the vision behind this might be that, look, the accurate description of reality is genuinely timeless. It's a view sub specie eternitatis. It's a view from God's eye. And from God's eye point of view, you don't need to think about what's always or sometimes or never or was or will be the case. That way of thinking is all perspectival and all, should never be combined conceptually or whatever with the view from above. Perhaps that's something like that's motivating the Fregean view, and it might also help. It might also be part of what's motivating the idea that propositions ought to be time specific in order to be eternal. And then another alternative, which I like myself, but we can discuss it if people are interested in, is that it's really wrong to think that there's a distinction to be made between eternal and timeless truth, or any kind of distinction along the lines that are being made in the first alternative. There's nothing wrong with saying, and it's perfectly correct to say that the view sub specie eternitatis is a view. It describes reality in a way that's always the case. And so this frees the B theorist to describe a consistent view. So in other words, sorry, to bring it back to the puzzle, what's false, I should say, to be specific. On this view, what you would say is the mistake that Brogaard is making is to deny, to assert 6. It's 6 that we should be denying. The mistake is to think that if something's the case at a time, then it must be that, if you ascribe existence of some object at a time, then you must be saying the object is located at that time. And that's a mistake. You shouldn't treat at as always inducing location. So there's nothing wrong with saying Socrates exists, therefore Socrates exists at every time. The mistake is in thinking that implies that Socrates is located at every time. And if you take that view, you're quite free to say, as a B theorist, yeah, look at the block, Socrates exists. And indeed, Socrates always exists. Exists at every time. But that's nothing more than to say that he exists, on my view. They're equivalent, on my view. I think the timelessness types of eternalists won't like that. But it seems to avoid the problem that Brogaard has nicely brought out in terms of the Fregean view. So I'm inclined to think the right view for the B theorist in terms of this debate is to say, yes, I'm a or at least up to this point, is to say, yes, I'm a propositional eternalist. Every truth is always true. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. It doesn't lead to these kind of disastrous results. Is the A theory compatible with propositional eternalism? In other words, if you start out as a propositional eternalist, can you still be an A theorist? That is an interesting question. And I'm inclined to think not. Minimally, according to the A theory, the present time is metaphysically special relative to other times. And so if you're an A theorist, you must think that this time, N, is metaphysically special relative to other times, compared to other times. But the proposition, given that that's true, given that that's the case, then the proposition that N is metaphysically special relative to other times is true from the principle about propositions and truth at the start. And given propositional eternalism, it's got to be always true. So you're going to end up with the disastrous result as an A theorist that the specialness of this time, which you have to have given the A theory, is going to be eternal, right? This time is always going to be special relative to other times. And that's clearly not a result that an A theorist is going to want, because it says effectively that from their perspective, time is frozen in some sense. It's frozen on, the present is frozen on this moment. So to get the present moving, if it's really distinct from other times, you just can't have propositional eternalism across the board, it looks like. Or if you have propositional eternalism, you can't, in other words, if you have propositional eternalism, it looks like you can't get the present to move. Okay. How much time do I have left? Sorry. How much? 4 or 5 minutes, okay. Wow. So that's the first half of my talk. You see I'm out of practice. I'm just going to make one, I think I can make a point in 5 minutes that's worth making. But maybe that was appropriate because I think it's interesting to talk about metaphysical propositional eternalism. So the contrary view, which I thought sounded at the start like the sensible view, is propositional temporalism, which says that there are temporary truths. Some things are true, but not always true. That view is closely associated with Arthur Pryor. Interestingly, one doesn't see a great deal of specific commitment to the view in the history of philosophy, although one imagines a bit like presentism is supposed to be. I mean, I'm not sure if that's true about presentism, but that it's somehow taken for granted, or maybe people just didn't have the resources, the conceptual resources to express it. I'm going to just skip those. I think the most interesting question when we consider propositional temporalism, we've seen that propositional eternalism looks incompatible with the A theory. An interesting question is whether propositional temporalism is compatible with the B theory. So can you be someone who thinks that no time is metaphysically special with respect to any other? No time is, this moment isn't distinguished metaphysically from other moments. All times are on a par. And also think that the truths about reality genuinely, I'm trying to avoid the use of the word genuinely change. Can you think that no time is metaphysically special and there are propositions that change from true to false in the way that propositional temporalism tells us they do? One thing I'm really interested in about Keane's book is that Keane Dore's book is that he's got an argument that as soon as you accept propositional temporalism, you are automatically committed to the A theory, which I think would come as a surprise to many people who would want to say, no, I can believe in the block universe. I can believe that all times are on a par, that, presentness is merely relative, and even more specifically, things that tie my view to our current best physics of time. And I can also think that, in some sense, the truths change, the truths about the world change. Certainly, at least I can say, I believe things that are sometimes true and sometimes false, right? So you might at least say, I certainly have the contents of some of my beliefs, surely. I mean, this relates to what you were saying, Craig, about the tensed and tenseless perspectives on discounting. You might want to say, look, surely there's a distinction to be made on that kind of view between contents that are temporary, that refer to the now, or in some sense indexicalize, and contents that are permanent. Dor says no. And I think getting to the bottom of why he says no and why other people think this is a really weird result is one of the most interesting debates you can have in this area. So Dor's view, I'll just summarize effectively. So what he argues is that, look, if there are temporary truths, if there really are truths that vary in their truth value over time, then there's going to be a particular time marked out in some way by these variable claims. And effectively, they're going to end up pointing at a certain time, because there's going to be one time where whatever is true at that time. So, I mean, maybe the example is good. So, you know, the sun is either shining or it's not. If it is, then the proposition that the sun is shining is true, and all the instances at which it's false are inaccurate. So we just ignore all that. So if it's true that the sun is shining, now we can ignore all the moments as inaccurate where the sun isn't shining. And now we add another truth. I'm in Barcelona. Now we can ignore all the instances at which I'm not in Barcelona. It's going to narrow the field again. And if we keep doing that, we keep thinking about what's true and which moments of time are excluded by what's true. The moments of time is the temporary truth will end up pointing an arrow at a certain specific time, and that'll be this time. So what he's saying is, look, as soon as you accept there are temporary truths, you end up with a kind of, by default, an arrow pointing at a certain specific time. And of course, at the next moment, the arrow of truth will point at, the arrow of temporary truth will point at that moment, and so on and so forth. And so you just can't have temporary truth without having some metaphysically distinct time, that being the time at which the temporary truths point by their truth. That's kind of quite interesting. It's a bit of a, it's a hard argument to fully grasp, but I think it's not, it'd be nice to have a picture or something, but I think it makes sense. Now, notice it only works, to anticipate a load of stuff I was going to say. It only works if you conceive of temporary truth as having to do with truth full stop, and you don't conceive of temporary truth specifically, oh sorry Silvia, do you mind doing the thing again? As having to do with truth relative to a time. Okay? Because if I just think about, if I think about temporary truth in terms of truth relative to a time, you know, look at your timeline. Now take all the truths that are true relative to times, the temporary truths on that second way of understanding the view. They're not going to point at any particular time. You're just going to have a pattern. You're going to have different patterns. You know, I'm in Barcelona, we'll pick out a few times. The sun is shining, we'll pick out different times, but not all. And they'll just vary in which times they point at. But they won't all be they won't, as it were, give you a single arrow pointing to a single time. You'll just see a different, you'll see, you know. Now you might say, oh, I can reconstruct the arrow by noting that the sun is in fact shining full stop, and that I am in Barcelona full stop, and then I'll get the arrow back, the one that points to the present, the specific arrow that points to the present. But without that extra assumption of absolute truth, the temporary truth won't point at a specific time. They'll just give you they'll just give you variation. And I think that's what's going on as between the B theorists who think they can be propositional temporalists and and what Dor is saying, which is to the contrary, that you can't be a B theorist and propositional temporalist. And the lesson is, if you're a B theorist and you want to be a propositional temporalist, you're going to have to take truth relative to a time as your fundamental concept of truth. Right? That's going to be your main concept of truth, truth relative to a time. As soon as you introduce truth simplicator, truth full stop, if Dor is correct, you'll end up with your temporary truth will all end up pointing at a certain time. They'll end up picking out one time as it were, the present. Now, I think that's a real difficulty for the eternalists, the B theorists, I'm going to stick with the B theorists who want to be propositional temporalists. I think that well, we can talk about what the problems are in the Q&A. Maybe that's the best thing. Graham is kindly pointing at his wrist. yeah, so to wrap it up, I hope I've given you a kind of entryway into this debate and a way of thinking about how your own views might, play into this this question. And just to sum up, I think that what's really cool about this question and about this way of thinking about philosophy of time is that it's foundational in the sense that it should, in some sense, split the field. Although there is this murky question of how to interpret propositional temporalism, which in itself adds an extra dimension of interest. But I think it's much more interesting than the presentism eternalism debate, for example, these ontological debates, because it takes us to questions about just the nature of reality in general, rather than the sort of slightly simpler question or lower order question of just what there is, what kinds of things there are. And I think the question of how reality is in general is in some sense a kind of richer and maybe more interesting, philosophically interesting question than in its temporal aspect than whether, there are things that exist in the past or something like that, which is still a good debate, but it's just, I think this is interesting as well. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniel. So, Graham.
Oh, sorry, do you want me to do
Yeah,
it?
of course, also people from home, if you want to.
I can do the microphone if you want.
Oh, well, I can do that.
Oh, why not? I don't mind.
Hi, thanks for that. This is an issue I've thought a bit. I mean, I agree with you about the big point that how we phrase a theory matters quite a bit here. But I think that I always use the dynamic static distinction, where dynamism is basically entailed by temporaryism. Like that's just different expressions of the same thought. So there are versions of a view, and it hovers in and out of focus for me. But you have a view in which you start off with times as a truth relative to a time. So you get truth, at a time on a timeline or something, very similar to the 2012 paper I did with Ray Briggs. You get that, and then you go, right, these timelines have like an end. And so the time at the end of the timeline, that's your present one. So you assess your timeline relative to that present one. And then there's just a fact, there's a temporary fact about where the timeline ends. Yep. And that's going to give you this derivative notion of true simpliciter, but your fundamental one is relative. And I can never quite make up my mind whether that's going to count as having a metaphysically special, in scare quotes, time that all the truths point to, or merely having this kind of derivative thing in a way that is a counterexample to you. I mean, it really depends what counts as metaphysical specialness, but it's not, as it were, ontologically privileged.
Well, except insofar as
it's the latest one.
The latest time,
but that's not an ontological privilege. It's just a topological one.
I'd like to be the latest something. I think I feel pretty special. No, I think that's I mean, it would, if the idea is just that truth simplicator is truth relative to the present time, where the present time is the latest time. Whether you think lateness is really special or not, it defines truth simplicator for you in a way that gives you everything you want, I think, to be a temporalist and an atheist in the way that Dor is thinking. Because I mean, just think of, I mean, here's one useful way of doing it. Just take the truths about the block as it is at any given time as sort of complete propositions that are sometimes true. So imagine the abstract representations of the block as it is at each time. Now, all but one of those abstract times will be false, because all but one of them will incorrectly identify the latest slice of the latest hyperslice. And they say, oh, well, look, one of these is true, the one that correctly identifies the latest hyperslice, and you know, the true such proposition is such that everything it entails is true. And so you'll get, you know, the temporary truth that, and so, sorry, all your temporary truths, you'll be able to say, you know, to be true at a time is to be, so you can say, you know, for a proposition to be true at a time is for it to be entailed by one of these abstract times, and one of them is true, so everything it entails is true as well. The eternal things and the things that are only true relative to some of these times. And so you immediately get the right results. So that's a good way of translating. I mean, that's a useful thing I like to do is if you've got the kind of view of times as concrete things, but you've still got truth and fictor, you can put it all up in a kind of proposition. Just pretend that times are propositions in that way, and then you'll see that it's, yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, Giuliano.
Sorry, it's good.
I thought that was really interesting. I really like this phrasing, this debate and with this question: is temporal propositionalism compatible with the B theory? I like that, and I don't have any objection or useful comment. It's more like I would like you to explain me something I was a bit puzzled about.
Yep.
So you're saying, the question is, can B theorist be a propositional temporalist? And you say, yes, if truth is relativized to time, okay? Yep. But if it's true simpliciter, then you end up with pointing at one time as special. And you say, like, he and Doris defended that. And then what's puzzling me is that you said many people were surprised about that, because I find that quite obvious. You know, I find it hard to resist the move from a true simpliciter to true at all times, which would come out false. So I think it's quite obvious. Why would B theorists be surprised by Kean's argument here? That's why I didn't get.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, thanks. That's excellent. I mean, that just allows me to slightly fill in a gap that I would have in some ways, but I think it's something I should have talked about had I judged the time better. So I think the answer is, I mean, and I think this is why it's such an interesting question, and it really goes back to how I characterized propositions at the very beginning of the talk. So I said that I'm going to frame this whole thing in such a way that, and I think it's the way that makes the debate interesting to me, in such a way that talk about propositions is effectively talk about reality. And so to ask whether there are temporary truths or all truths are permanent is to ask something about the nature of reality itself. Whether you do that via Platonic objects or whether you do it in a nominalist spirit doesn't really matter too much. But I think that the B theorists who think they can be propositional temporalists are not thinking of, in some cases at least, are not thinking of propositions as playing exactly that role. They're thinking the primary role for a proposition is to, in some sense, model the contents of our thoughts. That's what they're really interested in. So they'll be motivated by something like Pryor's "thank goodness that's over" argument, which, if you're not familiar, the idea is, look, if the contents of all our thoughts were eternal, then it would be very hard to understand how I could be relieved that a certain event is in my relative past than in my relative future, since if the content of the thought was, if the content of my belief about that event was eternal, you know, my perspective on it wouldn't, you know, if it's earlier than this time, then it's always been earlier than this time. So why would my opinion change on whether I ought to be relieved or not, or something like that? So the insight was that eternal contents don't seem to account for our care about where we are relative to what's happening. Again, this relates to other talks. And so some people say, oh, well, so these kind of B theorists say, so the contents of thought must be temporary, some of them at least. You know, that this event is in the past must be a temporary content of belief. And this relates, David Lewis on the Deasy and indexicals, and, you know, Perry on indexicals and all that. You know, I think, look, the thought is, of course we can have indexical thoughts without thinking that, you know, there's a spotlight on me, as it were, as the special person. And of course, we can have spatially indexable thoughts without thinking that this place is special. So why can't we have temporary thoughts, which basically indexicalize to the time of utterance, without thinking this moment is special? Of course we can. So you might represent it as, say, a function from times to truth values. You might say, my belief that this event is in the past, we'll just represent that, put in a time and you'll get true or false for that belief. And that's what it is to have a temporary belief. Now, I think that's all good and fine, but the role that propositions are being asked to play there is not exactly the role that we were specifying at the start. So, you might say, I can describe the content of your thought that this event is in the past. I can represent it as a function from times to truth values. But you can't believe that a function from times to truth values, right? Yeah, sorry. So I think it's to do with what the role is supposed to be. And if you specify the role as I did, I don't think that option will be on the table as an account of propositions. Sorry.
Yeah, so thanks. There is this sentence, so this expression not to take tense seriously, and so the expression per se is ambiguous. No, it's you can interpret it in the sense of at which level of the representation we should have tenses. If it's just on the surface of the linguistic expressions or deep in the proposition. Or you can take it as a metaphysical question. So pick up your favorite, account of tense in the representation at the level of the proposition or at the level of the character. Are those things actually, latching onto something real or not? That's the second question. Now, with respect to the second question, so would you think that these tenses catches something that is dynamic or because definitely there is a perspectival element. So, but one could say, well, look, tenses per se give us this perspectival element. Given that we are talking about temporal perspectival elements, if we take them seriously, unless we want a reality which is frozen, of course, we have to construe them as dynamic. But that's not something that comes from the tenses. It's something that comes from how we think about how we want them, to be, how we use them, basically.
Yeah.
And so, well, that's good.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's really good. That introduces a number of other things I'm really interested in. So, and excuse me if I kind of answer this in a way that just connects it more directly to my interest. So, I'll address the second thing first. I think that's a really good question, and I don't think it's totally obvious. And I think one thing, a lacuna in what I've talked about is the kind of fragmentalist view, where in some sense you get some sense of the temporariness of truth, but in some sense also without the arrow pointing to a specific time. And if that's whether or not that's what you had in mind, it does, at least intellectually, it gives you the possibility of splitting off those two different considerations, that reality has some genuinely perspectival aspect from there being a time at which that aspect uniquely picks out. And so I think a complete treatment of that question would have to take that fragmentalist option very seriously. So for the non-fragmentalist, I think, or non-Finian in some way, it's an assumption that you might say it's an assumption that it's just a given that we're not in a frozen universe. I mean, it's interesting you should say that, because I used to sort of write that down sometimes when I was describing a view, and then in the end I kind of stopped. And I think definitely think there's a tradition where you just my phenomenology of how long I speak for is way different to other people's, I think. Like more than other people. The mismatch is bigger than even from, no, I'm criticizing myself. I mean, this is like, I've been starved of. Okay, yeah. Perhaps we can address the other thing first, but yeah. Sorry.
So we have a few questions. And so I really
Yeah.
very
I'll do my best. I can't guarantee it.
So thank you very much. Two really just comments. So I think there's a connection between what you were saying about the differentiating the propositional temporalist B theorist from the A theorist by insisting on truth simpliciter with something Dean Zimmerman said in this dialectical paper, sort of the A theory, the B theory, and taking tense seriously. I think he's
Fantastic. Paper.
yeah got a similar line.
Yeah.
So the comment was just that I completely agree with you that you don't need a time determination in the content to have an eternalist proposition, and I also think it's interesting that the having a time determination in the content isn't sufficient either.
Yeah.
If you're so if you're a kind of supervaluationist open future person, you can have what you might want to call eternalist propositions in the sense that they're just describing the whole of history, but their truth value can vary in time. If
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so that's something I think another really interesting dimension of consideration here is when you get non-linear temporal structures, and I think that would, yeah, it makes a big difference to how you answer some of these questions. But I completely agree with you. I think it's really important that you don't mix it up either way. So eternal does not mean time specific in my sense of about a time, and time specific can't mean eternal either for various reasons. But one of them would be exactly those non-standard, as it were, non-linear models of time. Yeah, and a full treatment would have to take those into account very carefully. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a really good point. Quick. Okay. Mhm.
So I increased on something very aware of today, that you can formulate logical theory that spotlight theory where you have dynamism and then you have digital way.
Yep.
Then you could in principle maybe allow for propositional dynamism while maintaining the design.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point as well. I mean, it's a really good question. So I tend to think that's a very good argument, the one I presented. I think as soon as, so take the very simple moving spotlight view, you've got a timeline, you select, you know, the sort of dunder-headed version is just, you say there's this extra fundamental property, and you slap it onto one of the, you know, hyperslice. That's presentness. And then the, you know, simultaneity is defined by that too. And then the idea is just that, look, the simple argument is the truth that that time has that property, that has to change. It can't always be true. It can't just be true relative to that time, because it's, of course it's true relative to that time. It'll always be true relative to that time, but we want it to be true. We want it to end up being false when some other time is present as well. And that's, now, I think there are things you can do, there are complicated things you can do to try and muddy the waters there, and I think that's what your question nicely brings out. If you introduced a second time dimension, and you said, look, relative to a point in that time dimension, that time possesses the property, but relative to a point in that time dimension, some other time possesses that property. You might think, well, in some sense, all those truths are eternal. At least they're hyper-eternal and or some, well, perhaps not. But you might just look at that picture and say, that's one where, okay, once I've introduced hypertime, I've solved the problem of moving the spotlight without having to introduce you might think, without having to introduce non-eternal truths. That's one thought you might have. And that's something Brad Scow, I think, tries to do in a few different ways in his book on the moving spotlight. My slight concern is that the hypertimes are going to introduce a kind of propositional temporalism, which I think is just playing the role that normal propositional temporalism plays at the first order of time. And so it's going to be propositional hypertemporalism essentially. And you know, why go for propositional hypertemporalism when you can have time do all the work? It seems weird to me. Yeah. But it's worth exploring. I think hypertime is a way to go in that direction.
So let's thank our speaker again.